there was a world in which in the late 90s, early 2000s, we didn't really have personalization yet. That was all very out there back in the late 90s when I was at Netflix. We were one of the first entities before Amazon and others to actually incorporate personalization based on what we could tell your interests were based on what movies you watched, and became a recommendation system. What's kind of ironic is Neil and I now are working on a recommendation system for how we manage natural resources to get the most bang for the buck in terms of, and it's sort of a personalized way to look at land management in the context, in the socio-ecological context of where you're trying to make a decision about how to restore ecosystem resilience, ecosystem function, and and where you can go to mitigate risk to both ecosystems and communities.
Welcome back to the Clean Techies podcast, the #1 podcast for climate tech entrepreneurs. In this episode, I chat with Allison Wolff, CEO of Vibrant Planet. Vibrant Planet is basically bringing the tech knowledge from the early FAANG days and applying that to land tender and wildfire resistance. Their platform is a prioritization system for land management restoration and allows for real-time scenario planning, monitoring, and reporting. These assessments can even help qualify projects for conservation finance. Allison brings a rolodex of experience working with top companies in sustainability like Google, Meta, Netflix, eBay, Project Drawdown, and more, and is now applying all of that knowledge with other star-studded experts to solve the wildfire risk problem. In this episode, we talk about how she learned from the original recommendation algorithms at Netflix and is applying that logic here. The thing I like to think about is when we first found out that things were online instead of DVDs and they just knew what we wanted to watch. It's that magic being applied here. The issues in wildfire prevention, her work making Silicon Valley greener, cloud-based technologies in ClimateTech, why they chose to be a public benefit corp and how that works with their open data nonprofit, how their solution can shape future markets, and more. As always, thanks so much for listening and enjoy the episode. All right, Allison, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you on this
I'm
lovely
doing
Friday
well.
afternoon?
Yeah, it's a little grayer here in New York, so I don't know how lovely we can call it, but where you are, I think it's a lot better, right?
Yes, well, it's a little weird here on the topic of climate change because it's still March and I live at pretty high elevation in the Sierra Nevada, and I got eaten alive by mosquitoes the other night, so that's a little concerning. There's a lot about how early spring is springing
Yeah,
that I am
that's
living in
everywhere.
right now.
Yeah, that's getting warmer. Great way to start off the conversation, setting the scene. I'd love to just introduce you to the audience. Who are you and what do you do?
So I am Allison Wolff. I am CEO of a public benefit corporation called Vibrant Planet. We are a what we call ourselves as a common operating picture for land managers. So anyone that's working on community resilience to wildfire and other climate impacts, or anyone working on nature-based climate solutions and nature accounting. So we're a company that helps make informed, coordinated decisions, which is the idea of a common operating picture. It's a term from firefighting and the military that is really moving at speed. These really critical coordinated actions, we're sort of taking that term from those spaces, because if we don't start acting like climate change and wildfire is an emergency and dealing with the fundamental change that needs to happen to keep people and ecosystems safe, we're going to lose everything. So hence us stealing that term for what we do, which is more usually slower change, slower foundational work than like emergency type stuff.
I think that parallel that you put makes it really, really clear. One thing we talked about before the show is that you have somewhat of an ethos of being a collaboration system, but more so, I think this emulates almost the ethos that you came into Netflix with. So for the audience, Allison is actually sort of an OG in the big tech space. FAANG, Netflix, she was the early director of marketing. And you actually had a really, really great comparison between what you were doing then and building the recommendation system and subscription system and what you're doing now. So what is that parallel and how do you think it's informing how you build Vibrant Planet?
Yeah, so for those of your listeners that are old enough to have gone through this or care about it, there was a world in which in the late 90s, early 2000s, we didn't really have personalization yet. now everything is personalized, right? Like all of our shopping on Amazon, we can roam around the physical world and get personalizations as we walk. That was all very out there back in the late 90s when I was at Netflix. Our chief product officer at Vibrant Planet was also the chief product officer and head of engineering at Netflix. So we get to work together again now. We really kicked off. We were one of the first entities before Amazon and others to actually incorporate personalization based on what we could tell your interests were based on what movies you watched, and became a recommendation system based on those interests, and then eventually what your friends liked. And so what's kind of ironic is Neil and I now are working on a recommendation system for how we manage natural resources to get the most bang for the buck in terms of, and it's sort of a personalized way to look at land management in the context, in the socio-ecological context of where you're trying to make a decision about how to restore ecosystem resilience, ecosystem function, and where you can go to mitigate risk to both ecosystems and communities. And so our system today is basically recommending where to go to get the most bang for the buck in avoided potential losses forecasted out, and then ecosystem services enhancements. So where can we go to safeguard carbon sinks? Where can we go to make sure water stays clean and reliable? And where we can make sure that forests or grasslands or shrublands are still hosting biodiversity, or we can even increase biodiversity if we make the right move. So it's basically recommending where to go to do what, to do both of those things, the risk side and the benefit side.
And so it's not only giving these people the ability to engage with that information, but also then helping them choose and navigate that path. I think this really, really relates to something you'd mentioned, which is when you entered the industry, land management was not transitioning to cloud-based technologies. So I'd love to hear from you. What was it like then, and how do you think you were able to be a catalyst in that?
Yeah, so I came into this space through some work I was doing with an impact investor that was a Silicon Valley tech titan, really concerned about climate change, started to try to figure out what could a new play be in climate change that would put a dent in the problem. Obviously, a lot of people had been racing into that over the last 5-10 years. As I was trying to figure out a strategy for this impact investor, Paradise, California burned, and we had the 2018 fire season in California, other parts of the West, and then also Australia. That was the worst anyone could imagine until 2020 came. And so what I started to realize is how bad the catastrophic wildfire problem is, and how fast we're going to lose ecosystems that are burning, but also started to realize how catastrophic the downstream and downwind impacts are as the fire problem grows. So if you think about just forests alone as an ecosystem, 70% of water originates in forests. They're playing a huge role in providing clean, abundant water. They host 80% of terrestrial biodiversity. And then, of course, they're doing this massive job of sequestering carbon. About a third of the emissions we emit as humans each year are pulled down by trees. But what's happening in fire-adapted landscapes, which is about 53% of land on Earth, and fire-adapted means those ecosystems evolved with fire, and they therefore need fire to be healthy. So think about the Western United States, Mediterranean Europe, Chile, Australia, parts of Asia, where we hear about these really big fires. Those are ecosystems that evolved with fire, and where we've tried to control fire, and where we've had a very heavy impact on the kind of original forest or grassland shrubland structure as humans living in those places. And so they're burning catastrophically at a very alarming rate with extreme impacts on the water, biodiversity, and carbon. And then, of course, we have massive emissions that people that are working in fields growing our food and picking our food are in affordable housing in cities, it quickly becomes a social justice and equity issue, where smoke is heavily impact human health as well. So what I saw coming into the space as a newbie from Silicon Valley into a space of foresters and land managers and scientists is an industry that was being forced into collaboration because fire doesn't care who owns the land. It's going to rip across everybody's boundaries. And so Forest Service, BLM, parks, fire districts, counties were being forced into a collaborative planning exercise. They have to navigate environmental regulations like the National Environmental Protection Act, which protects threatened and endangered species like spotted owl and marten, and protects water and tribal rights and all kinds of things for good reason. And so it's a lot to navigate. You need a ton of information that represents all the different values in a landscape across built infrastructure, as well as all the natural assets that you're negotiating across different interests with the jurisdictions. So imagine trying to negotiate these conversations over like 2 million acres with a bunch of people on paper, how hard that would be. And where there's a lot of distrust between nonprofits looking out for a species like spotted owl and the Forest Service that has a history, unfortunately, of cutting too many trees for an economy around timber. They're very much managing for ecological benefits now, but there's still a long history of distrust. So what was needed is the ability to harness the power of the cloud, to have powerful compute that can help those different perspectives collaborate more effectively with really rich information so that they can quickly get to like, where do we have an issue with this neighborhood and this spotted owl nest? See it spatially and understand what the issues are so they can have productive conversations that they can resolve, and where they can also see for the first time, because of a system like ours, where they actually agree. Like there was just a blanket, like, I don't trust your data, I'm just going to wait and sue you, and then nothing happens. And that's unfortunately what was happening, is these like 10-year processes that end in litigation. And that was where I was like, oh boy, we're going to face catastrophic failure. And a lot of the solution was to modernize with technologies like the cloud, machine learning, to map vegetation and other species and things like that.
So you became aware of this space from exposure to other great people who were thinking about the same problem, almost forced in by current events, natural disasters, which is probably the tale of a lot of people, unfortunately, especially if you look at the adaptation mitigation side. You entered an industry that had some very complicated dynamics between the people that are supposed to be helping it and on the side, but not everyone was on the same page. And it was also not easy for them to be on the same page because they're managing vast amounts of land through an undigitized system, essentially.
That's right.
And go ahead.
Oh, I mean, I can just add the other big issue and what we've invested heavily in, which was a very, very big scientific and engineering problem that just wasn't possible inside federal agencies, for example, or academic scientific organizations where great R&D is happening, but those entities lack the sophistication of using the cloud and machine learning, and sometimes aren't even allowed access to those things. So that's where one of the issues was there might be a policy decision. Like right now, we have a very climate forward president who is really, putting unprecedented amounts of money through the Inflation Reduction Act towards climate smart forestry, climate smart land management. It was impossible before a system like ours to take a policy like that all the way to the ground, where you're getting permits on what small trees do we need to remove around the big carbon storing trees. Where do we put beneficial fire back on land to get to a sustainable carbon carrying capacity? Right now, it's a mind twist, but in many places in the Western US, for example, we have 2 to 10 times the number of trees that would have been there before European Americans really fundamentally messed up the ecosystem. And so there's this weird twist in what we've been taught about plant trees, don't cut trees, where we actually have to cut trees and put good fire on land in order to save forests and get to that natural number of trees per acre that can be sustained and provide sustained carbon sequestration benefit and water biodiversity, all those benefits that we get when a forest or grassland or meadow is functioning. They are powerful natural climate solutions for us. But right now, unfortunately, because of our actions, they're not functioning as well, and they're not doing those. They're not delivering those services as well as they used to. So that part of the problem with the information not being able to travel from the national scale to the permit scale and where you do what action and back up where you can aggregate elegantly what's happened on the ground and what can we learn about what's happened on the ground so that that can shape priorities and policy at the national scale. That requires a tree up, like very fine scale data structure. And that was a very, very, very hard technical and scientific problem that we have now solved through some very, very advanced machine learning and science.
You said a couple of really great things there. The first is I think there's a point in time, I feel like, in every person's life when they're engaging with content, which is you are an expert at, on social media, and you look at the video of a firefighter or a conservationalist burning the ground, and you're like, what are they doing? Why are they doing this? But you come to learn that it's actually to protect against fires. And I feel like that's a turning point in most people and how they engage with content and climate media, because then they then realize that there's a lot of nuances to actually helping mitigate some of these, ecological disasters, environmental disasters. So what you said reminded me a lot of that. It's actually really interesting to see how the lack of tech sophistication was an issue, and maybe that also is why something like the IRA could have never been implemented until this point in time, and seeing how your technology enables the ability for there actually to be policy in the first place. I think this is something that you can uniquely speak to, which, not most people can. As a Silicon Valley tech outsider, you came into an industry that probably was populated mostly by insiders, and they probably had some reservations to people who were coming in from the outside. What was that experience like, and how did you overcome maybe some of the stigma that came with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. There was a lot of people would take a meeting because I think there was a realization that and a desire to harness technology and technologies like remote sensing, LiDAR and satellites. The space was aware that those things were now in the world and they should harness them, but they didn't have the skills to harness them. But then there is a deep mistrust of the private sector. The world of natural resource management has largely been grant funded, where there's a RFP for a grant funded tool or a body of science that needs to get cracked. And then people apply for the grant. They get the grant, they build the thing, and then there's no model to sustain the thing. But there's been and the system's just so used to living in that world, it's hard to help them see another way because it's just, humans don't like change. We founded a public benefit corp. We actually started a nonprofit first and realized that grant funded things often wither on the vine because there is no sustainable business model to maintain a tool like we've built if it's grant funded. There's no way to update security, fix it if it breaks. There aren't many payers into a system to ensure that it continues to evolve for users' needs. Often grants are focused on a part of a watershed or a forest unit and doing a study on evapotranspiration or whatever. And so we really saw a need to build for scale from a speed perspective, like doing this foundational vegetation map for the United States, but also where venture funding was the only way to get that done with badass engineers, right? And then separately making sure that we could think holistically about ecosystems, mountaintop to ocean, and how they're connected because they are. And so we have to think about them and the interventions that we're trying to make. When we do something at the top of the Sierra Nevada where I live, that impacts all the way down to the Pacific Ocean, all the communities, the farmlands, everything between here and there. So we have to think that way, but that's where grant systems are broken. There's a great role for grants to fund specific science endeavors and education endeavors and things like that. But we really felt like creating a sustainable business model with a subscription model, again, kind of mimicking what we had done at Netflix, like really starting to create a whole subscription business model that many followed later. We're applying that here as well.
You talked about the transition from going from a nonprofit to a public benefit corp. And I just want to double tap on that really quickly because I don't think that's something many people are familiar with. And so what was the decision behind that and what is the difference?
Yeah, and the nonprofit still exists. So what we ended up doing is we spun our public benefit corp out of the nonprofit, and they operate as a hybrid nonprofit public benefit corp structure. And so the nonprofit is now essentially a data commons, whereas our public benefit corporation is building out novel data, like our vegetation foundational map. We are making that map publicly available. And the nonprofit is helping build scientific community around using that data for scientific pursuits, educational pursuits, those kinds of things that could be really helpful to the whole space. So it's a great model, and there are things that the nonprofit can go get non-dilutive capital for, like grant capital, to solve a really hard science problem like species detection in forests is something that's eluded scientists for decades. I think our team has the chops to potentially take that on in collaboration with a bunch of Forest Service scientists, and they've got incredible labs. We can lock arms and crack that together. We can then take that data and curate it in with other public data sets that we're essentially a master curator of, munge it into our scenario planning and monitoring system, and put it into people's hands. And that data product can go out into the world for scientific pursuits and educational pursuits. So we've got this model that's finally cranking now, where we can solve problems and it's part of our public benefit. As a public benefit corporation, is making a bunch of new novel science and data sets available for all these different public good pursuits.
Hey guys, sorry for the interruption. I just need a few seconds because Soma and I have two quick favors to ask. Putting out the show each week takes about 15 to 20 hours between us, so it's a lot of effort, and it would mean the world to us if you would leave a review and mention your favorite episode. Secondly, if you're not already, go over and subscribe to the podcast on Substack. The content is free, but if you like hanging out with us each week, maybe we're even the kind of guys you'd like to buy a coffee for on occasion, consider becoming a paid subscriber. For the cost of one lavender latte a month, you can help us immensely. Thank you for tuning in consistently and helping us to share our guests' stories. Now back to the show.
That's super cool. I mean, I've been hearing so much enthusiasm coming from concern about the lack of data and the lack of data standardization in climate, but also so much enthusiasm about how can we build up data sets to essentially build a model that can help us figure out what the Earth should be and what the Earth will be. And
Yes.
the standardization is a huge issue there. The maintenance is a huge issue there. But seeing how you've tied the nonprofit to the PBC and have that ongoing interaction, I think that's a way to keep people constantly engaged and concerned about the quality of the data. Do you see that? I mean, was that part of the thought process there?
For sure. Yeah. And so where data can just continue to get better and better and better. And we just have a core belief that data really should be a public service or a public utility in a way. And government would ideally be filling all the gaps. There's tons of incredible data from USGS and Forest Service labs and academia. We're really a data-rich country. Part of the problem was harnessing data and putting it into useful context to inform decisions, because data doesn't matter if you don't put it into an informative context, right? And so that was lacking. But then there were real gaps that we're taking on ourselves or in collaboration with others on some of the things I mentioned, like this very fine scale vegetation model. Took a big team of engineers and scientists to crack, and there's new things around mapping connectivity corridor and detecting where beaver live or used to live and where we could reintroduce them to get outsized carbon water biodiversity benefit. And so there's lots of scientists in the Western United States, for example, that our biodiversity lead is plugging into to figure out, like, okay, what are the gaps for this particular species that we can pitch in on, and becomes like an engineering feat. And then we give that away for people to keep going with it and keep modeling off of it to create derivative data sets. And then each time we can just curate it in like we do with other public data sets to put it into those decision support contexts.
I love that. I mean, the nonprofit meets data, meets climate spaces. Not that big, but there's some super cool players in that. Climate Trace is one. They do some really cool work with the data they have. So just hearing that you guys are doing this too is phenomenal. I'm going to use what you said as a segue. You made my life a little easier. Talking about data, talking about using the data, you mentioned two things that I'd love to dive into. So the first is geospatial data. I've been like holding myself back a little bit because I am personally a geospatial data enthusiast, and I've also done a lot of work with geospatial data on the ag and land monitoring side. And I think it's an area where when you're in it, you realize its potential, but you also realize its limitations. So I'm curious for you, especially as you're building somewhat of like the next generation or the next version of this. What are you excited about when it comes to geospatial data and its future?
Yes. So we think we have geospatial data for natural resources, but it really has just happened the last few years with companies like ours, Pachama and others doing some of this work. So, we have things like Google Earth where we feel like we can fly into anywhere on Earth. When you're dealing with management and function of ecosystems, ecosystems operate in 3D. And so, part of what we're doing with geospatial data is creating essentially a digital twin that has as many as much of the natural structure in a picture a forest, right? There's berries and flowers growing under the canopy and grass, right? And then there's the trees themselves, and some of them are small and young, and some of them are big, and there's different species, and there's different spacing, and there might be a meadow in between. And that's all three-dimensional. And so one of the big breakthroughs with machine learning and then pulling in geospatial data from satellite technology and just two-dimensional high-resolution imagery that like the Department of Ag publishes and things like that, satellite imagery from Planet and the Sentinel system, which is the 10-meter scale system that is free from Europe. We're able to now harness a bunch of different geospatial data inputs, munge them together using machine learning to create these sort of digital twins. And then we're able to represent with geospatial data all the different values in that digital twin, trying to do as best we possibly can to mimic the complexity of nature, because when you're dealing with decisions, you have to honor that complexity as best you possibly can. Now, that's an impossible task and something we'll be striving towards forever. But if we can at least represent, in general, like threatened and endangered species, what we know about hydrology and how it moves in different types of landscapes. Carbon is pretty easy. Like we can take fine scale vegetation mapping and do the carbon calculation based on tree height and diameter. And we know what meadows store when they're working well, right? So we can do carbon estimations much more accurately than most other things, which is why carbon markets have been the most ready so far in the nature and the natural climate solution space. Built infrastructure, we have maps. We use Microsoft's open building layer like so many others do, and it's quite accurate. So what we're doing is taking geospatial data, and I think where we're rare is often companies are using geospatial data to observe and to do accounting, like things like carbon. We're doing those things and supporting the prioritization of action, because at least in the fire adapted ecosystems, but increasingly everywhere, including the Amazon, we have to prioritize the interventions that are needed at these fine scales, like literally at the tree level or a meadow level, to actually get the effects we want. And then we need to inform those decisions with as much robust science as we can. And then the other piece we're bringing into it is we're bringing together kind of initial decision support based on the best science we can get our hands on and munge together, really powerful forecasting to predict if we do this, then what happens across all this web of complexity. If we do this thing that optimizes, like for fire, we could pave the whole West and then we won't have towns burned down, but we will lose our water service, our carbon sequestration service, our houses for all the animals and all the biodiversity in all species, right? Animal and plant. We don't want to do that. So we have to be able to weigh trade-offs of this or that and the intensity of this or that. And we have to forecast what we think will happen. And then we have to monitor what actually happens. And then with the result of helping science become less wrong over time, because we can create these learning systems with the kind of added complexity of these systems are changing on us rapidly now. So it's a really complicated problem that we're trying to solve.
Right. And I feel like you're making my life easier. I feel like we might be in sync. You talked about the ML that you're using and how that applies to geospatial data. I know in our pre-show, I'll quote you here, you mentioned using some super cool ML that has really revolutionized what you've been able to do. Especially with talking to so many founders who are dealing with having to, do I market myself as AI or ML or not? A big issue is trying to communicate to, especially this is more to users than it is to, industry knowledgeable people, but that AI and ML has been around for a while. And a lot of these things have just become more public and more visible recently. I'm wondering how you feel about that with your technology. Has there been anything as of recent that's allowed you to combine these geospatial data sets that's different? Or was this something that's been in the making for, the past 3, 4, 5 years?
Well, a lot of these technologies were born out of companies like Meta, right? Where we were using algorithms to personalize ads. And so companies like ours and my team built a lot of those things at Netflix and Meta and Lyft. And so, teams like ours are harnessing what's been perfected around content and consumerism and applying it to natural resource management now. And that starts with mapping that complexity that I talked about. So hopefully I'm answering your question, but feel free to dig in on me more.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly it. Actually, just hearing about how the algorithms that were developed with Netflix and Meta and Uber, and now those are being used in a climate friendly context, it makes you think about, I think this is the parallel between what people say about the investment into rockets, how much investing into rockets propels forward the field of science. But then you hear the backlash of, is that necessary? Like, can't we get there another way? Whether or not you agree, it is really interesting to see how the growth of one industry can affect another. And I think you being able to talk to that anecdotally is like, I love it. It's phenomenal.
Yeah. And it's so odd to me, like coming into this space that we could get like pinpoint connecting a driver at Lyft to a person waiting at an airport to be picked up within minutes. We have that specificity in the built infrastructure to move cars to people, right? Or for me to use Google Maps to get to the coffee shop to meet my friend. We had not harnessed this technology yet to manage the things that we need for survival, which blew my mind. I mean, we did not have that kind of geospatial data. We weren't using machine learning or the cloud to make sure that we have water to drink and biodiversity that we forget we are dependent upon for survival, and carbon sequestration so that our climate actually functions, right? Like it just blew my mind that these things hadn't been harnessed yet, and it's still so nascent. It's really incredible, but it's certainly time. I think we're 10 years late, but the technology just matured enough in the last few years to actually harness it for this very, very complex problem.
I feel like it's something that's becoming more common, which is to just take a problem and apply something that's worked in another industry. I think people understood it in other contexts, right? How do you apply the retail model that works for Walmart, right? Jeff Bezos' big inspiration was Walton of Walmart. And so it's very clear there how one tool is applied to another. And I think in climate, people look at the layoffs that have happened. And one thing they think about is, there's motivated talent now in climate that are now looking at their impact. But a byproduct of that is you're getting really, really specific talent related to compute, AI, ML. And what does that do to the proliferation? I think you are the perfect example of that. What can we now look at in terms of the next 5, 10 years of the state of our data and AI and ML in climate? And I think I'm super excited to see where that goes.
Exactly. One of the things that makes us special is, we needed, when I was getting into this space, I had people say, like, how do we go get the people that built these platforms to focus on stuff that's not selling ads, like on fixing the climate. And so, I made it my mission to bring some of those people together. But, so often we humans, especially technology, creates things like, we will save the day. And the building, the design and the build has to be grounded in what's needed And for us and many other companies in the especially the nature-based climate space, it has to be grounded in really deep science and land management. And so we have this really special complexity on our team that brings together that really amazing computer science talent with specialists in forest ecology, fire hazard mapping and risk mapping, biodiversity, hydrology, climate, to figure out like what might this look like in these different climate futures. So it's really cool to watch these teams come together. We have policy expertise. Ashley Conrad Seda on our team came out of EPA and was really shaped Governor Brown's climate policy. He's been such a leader his whole career on climate policy. So it's like bringing these different mindsets together to do what's right for the policy frameworks that we're operating in, right? Like Trump is a very different policy framework than Biden on things like climate. And so we have to tune into that and build for that. The tech has to be grounded in the science. And so it's been really magical to watch these teams come together with radically different cultures and languages and work it out to build something together.
Before we move off of the topic of compute and data, because honestly, I feel like we could go on for another 2 hours. This is something that I don't think a lot of founders think about, or maybe they don't have the pleasure of thinking about it because they're focusing on finding product market fit. But a recent topic has come out about how much energy compute takes. It's not even a recent topic, but I think maybe some of Sam Altman's talking about nuclear fission kind of exploded the fact that this is relevant. There's a lot of buzz recently about the future energy demand of computational, cost, essentially, and doing things on the cloud. And as a climate-oriented company, I would love to know how you think about the energy you consume in building these platforms, because I think it's something that me as a product manager, especially as of recent, there's a new group called the Climate Product Leaders, and they're kind of championing this, which is we not only need to think about our KPIs and metrics as PMs and decision makers as better for the climate, we also need to think about our operations and processes as people who build software and use data as more climate friendly. So have you been thinking about that, and what does that process look like for you?
Yeah, well, ironically, a lot of my career in Silicon Valley was focused on exactly that and how to make the cloud greener. Or like, if a company like Meta has its own, data centers, right? And they're no longer operating in the cloud. They used to rent cloud space, but not anymore. So a lot of my career was working with this incredible man named Bill Weil, who was the green energy czar at Google, and then led all things sustainability at Facebook before it became Meta. And he and the team at Google and then Facebook really led the charge on how to build the most efficient data center possible, given the technology and techniques of the day. Tons of really cool experimentation. I worked with a group called once he and I both. So I was at Google with him, and then at Meta. Once we moved over to Meta, Facebook did a really interesting thing where they sort of one-upped Google, where they designed the most efficient data center on Earth, and they open sourced the design. So I had helped Google tell its story in hopes that people could replicate what it had done on data center efficiency, for example, in food system and all the cool things that Google's known for. Facebook kind of went up them by saying like, yes, we do that, and here's how to do it. And so with that, they launched a thing called the Open Compute Project, where we were able to get 300 plus companies together in sort of a space race for who could build the most efficient data center. And the deal was you had to open source the design. And now that group has taken on building materials and all kinds of things, right? So that's the kind of where competition can be a really beautiful thing in trying to continuously solve a big problem. Bill and I then worked with several NGOs to launch the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance, and where we were going into coal-based states and saying, we'll bring this many jobs, this much philanthropy, we're going to build a data center for a bunch of companies to use, or we'll each build our own. And we're going to power it with green energy that we're going to connect to the grid in Texas or Tennessee. And in doing that, it created part of the tipping point where we had enough fossil fuel energy coming onto the grid that the cost structure changed and renewable energy actually became cheaper than fossil fuels. So I've thought a ton about that. It is possible to run things very, very efficiently and with 100% renewable power. And so what's needed now is really strong policy advocacy from industry to take it all the way now, because these leading companies like Google and Facebook figured out a lot of stuff, and now we have to make that the standard so that this infrastructure doesn't cost us the climate, because we know how to do it. I mean, I was lucky enough to work with a guy named Bill McDonough who wrote a book called Cradle to Cradle, and he's like, we have infinite power. We have the sun. We have sun and wind and geothermal, and now it's just regulating. That's all we get to use. Figure it out. And so it's totally possible. We just have to hold that vision and get it done. And policy is a lever to really change that. Bill Weil he started a thing called Climate Voices, and that's what he does. It's kind of taking it to the next level.
Yeah, I mean, just being able to see that perspective, for you being able to be at the center of a lot of these different efforts of the big tech companies. I know we had this in the pre-show notes and everything, but I'm going to take this moment just to list out for the audience cohesively. You've done, there's like those LinkedIn jokes that were going around when SVB was collapsing, and the FTX mess was like all the places not to work, and I feel like you have the opposite. You worked at Netflix, Google, eBay, Project Drawdown, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, Facebook/Meta. You worked at basically almost all the cool places that you could, and all doing, I think, very sustainably oriented work. And I think being able to just speak to that in each way that you have is something that I'm so grateful to have, and be able to hear from you. The thing that I would love to do and summarize all of that, especially to make it useful for our audience, is if I'm a founder today, how can I tangibly think about making my processes greener? And do you have any advice on that?
Well, at this point, policy change is our biggest lever. So we're like this teeny weeny little startup on AWS. When I was working with Bill Weil, he was egging on from the Facebook seat, like, AWS, you're way behind, right? And Greenpeace was all over them. Like, Greenpeace created a campaign called Unfriend Coal, and that's what triggered Facebook to hire Bill from Google so that they could actually create a sustainable solution. NGOs like Greenpeace are really important in the ecosystem as a hammer to force change. And so, I think that things have come along. The climate pain has become great enough that I think leaders are really trying to figure out how to be climate smart for real. So I think as a leader of a company, I can't wait till we're big enough to help to be a nag inside AWS to keep pushing them to as far as they can possibly go. When we have enough weight to do that. Neil Hunt, our chief product officer, was chief product officer at Netflix for 18 years. And so he had a very heavy hand on what happened with AWS, because they built Netflix on AWS. So where you can have those power levers to really change the game from inside as a zealot for climate, that becomes really powerful. I think what startups like ours can do is sign on to company coalitions, be part of a crowd of voices of corporate demand for climate smart everything. So, I think that's the best thing to do, is to join alliances that are really working on these kinds of things. And then, of course, doing what you can yourselves. Definitely. As individuals.
And I know we're running up on time, so I definitely want to make sure we create room for just hearing, in your perspective, one of the things we didn't really get to talk about on this episode, might be due for part 2, is how you are able to provide value in terms of ranking and providing insight into a bunch of different solutions for land management, and also, I think, being just a general change maker in the nature-based solutions space. what are you looking forward to as the major challenges as you grow your company and the things you're keeping an eye out for?
Yeah, so we've to date built this really beautiful decision support and monitoring platform that helps with adaptive land management, current insights from monitoring, current conditions data, all the values we can possibly back up with data in nature so that people can weigh trade-offs with agility in changing situations and new information, right, all the time. So I mentioned earlier that the outputs of our system provide plans that forecast avoided potential losses to built infrastructure, but also things of value in nature like carbon sinks and biodiversity and water. And then it also projects where you can get the most bang for the buck in ecosystem services enhancements. What's next for us is to basically shape markets around risk mitigation, think insurance, utilities, that kind of thing. And then also the natural climate solution space and nature accounting space, where we're really starting to, as a community, figure out how do we value nature and how do we get markets, including every corporation in the world, to pay for the services nature's providing for us. So that's kind of where we're going next, now that we've built this kind of foundation of data, really sophisticated models, forecasting and monitoring capabilities. Now we can actually stand up an economy that is paying for resilience, whether it's avoided losses or potential life-giving ecosystem services. So that's really where we're going. As a startup, that's a lot to take on, and we're doing it as fast as we possibly can because we are so late on doing this. I mean, we're going to lose many, many millions of acres of forests. I mean, bark beetle has killed billions of trees in North America. We're losing forests and shrublands and grasslands to fire, where things just don't grow back. Like, we're just creating these moonscapes that, unless we manhandle them back into a forest, they're just going to be moonscapes for a long time. So we lose all those services. So we're moving as fast as we possibly can. We're lucky to have a team that's worked at scale in both the science and the technology side to do what we can before it's too late. We're trying like hell.
I love it. I just want to say, like, I feel like I understood what you did ahead of this time, but honestly, seeing the way and the thoughtfulness that you guys have created, not only the problem statement, but also the team and the execution of it, is, I feel inspired just to look at the space. And I think that's potentially the biggest takeaway that I'd love for everyone to get from this, which is, you see energy, you see mobility, you see built environment. I mean, I interface with that day to day, but there really is so much opportunity to be at the forefront of digitizing a legacy industry. And in climate, we need all the progress we can get. So I just want to thank you for doing this, and thank you for coming on, because I think this has been incredibly informational in terms of how you can really take, purely tech, purely outsider background and transform an industry. So
Thank
I
you
really,
so
really
much.
appreciate this.
Thank you.
Before we sign off, where can the audience find you?
We're at Vibrant Planet, and we actually answer emails. So feel free to reach out to us if you're someone that's at a company and you're thinking about moving into the climate tech or natural resource management space. Love for you to keep an eye out for new job postings on our website and on LinkedIn. You can follow me on LinkedIn as well. Be in touch. And if you want to collaborate on something, we are very much about locking elbows with others trying to solve complementary problems. So also reach out if you're kind of in our realm and you see an idea based on this conversation that we could actually work on together.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Guys, wow, what an episode. That was really great. To give you guys some context, just by looking at Allison's LinkedIn, she has a rock star list of previous roles: Netflix, Google, eBay, Project Drawdown, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, Facebook/Meta. But honestly, I feel like the most impressive thing she's doing is building Vibrant Planet. We said this at the end of the show, but it really feels like she's digitizing an entire industry. And it almost feels like, to me, like she's taking the same way that she was part of the group that built Netflix, built the origin of the tech industry, and now using that trailblazer mentality to build the origin of sort of the digitized land management industry. Obviously, I thought it was amazing. I think you guys can hear that, but I'll try to keep my takeaways to 3, but that might be a bit hard. The first is how she's basically applying her knowledge, like I said, from building the original subscription model and recommendation model from Netflix and applying that to her work in Vibrant Planet. It's like, talk about the dream of having the best of the best working to solve climate change. The second thing is their organizational model. This is small and maybe not relevant for some, but as someone who works in philanthropy, the status of organizations is often a barrier to working with the best people. But Vibrant Planet's hybrid public benefit core and nonprofit model is just so cool. I think it allows them to do the best of both worlds. And startups facing this problem should consider doing something similar. Third, her technology is creating a way for governments to be able to tangibly divert resources into solutions in nature-based solutions and land management. I think that this makes sense, and it makes you think about what other industries where we just need the right recommender platform for the government to step in. Like, what is that one visibility into the industry that will allow this, multi-million, billion-dollar incentive package that just propels the industry forward? And finally, speaking probably a little more topically, her knowledge on green compute and building cloud applications sustainably, it's such a hot topic now, but the fact that she's been working on it for some time and we didn't even get to talk about that, we're definitely due for a part 2. Like, honestly, I feel like it's on me a little bit for not getting to that. But she's just working on so many cool things. I feel like we really did fill up the time. Anyway, let us know your favorite parts. Again, thank you all for making this possible. Episodes like this really make me feel so privileged to be able to talk to people like this and so grateful that we have this. And then, till next time.